I need to do this.
Jody Russo had sworn 5 years ago, never get involved with the Mafia again. Her father died because of that life. She almost died too. Got out of everything, changed her name and became a bartender. Normal life. Until she saw Hector Ricci, the most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast, sitting in a restaurant across from the bar where she worked. And when she saw the rifle reflection in the window of the building across the street, aimed at him, the instinct from years of training kicked in. She had only 3 seconds, and only one way to divert the shooter's attention without causing panic. Jody crossed the street, entered the restaurant, and went straight to Hector Ricci, and then kissed him. And hello, my name is Lena, the creator of this channel. Right now on screen, I'm showing you Darlene and Barbara's comments. Thank you so much for the compliments, everyone. But before we continue, answer me this. Do you think a relationship with a mobster can work out for someone who wants to forget the Mafia forever? Tell me down below, and maybe your comment will appear in the next video. Chapter 1. The Kiss That Saves.
Trust me.
I was wiping down glasses when I saw the reflection, and it was like the 5 years of training I'd buried alongside my father came roaring back to life in a violent, urgent snap. The glass of the window in the building across the street caught the light in the wrong way, and my stomach dropped because I knew that gleam. It was the reflection of a rifle, and the barrel was pointed directly at the Italian restaurant across the street, where Hector Ricci sat at a window table as if he didn't have a single enemy in the world. My heart took off, and I dropped the glass in the sink with a sharp clatter that made Jamie turn her head in my direction. But I was already calculating distances and probabilities the way my father taught me when I was only 15, and still thought the Mafia was glamorous. 10 seconds until the shot, maybe less if the shooter already had his finger on the trigger, and the police would never arrive in time even if I screamed right now. Screaming would cause panic, and the shooter would fire anyway, because men like that don't abort missions just because someone screamed. I had one option, only one, and it was absurd and dangerous, and would probably put me in the crosshairs of whoever had hired the assassin. But Hector Ricci was the most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast, and letting him die meant war in the streets, blood spilled, innocence in the crossfire, and maybe, just maybe, a part of me that had never really left that life wanted to prove I still knew how to act under pressure. Jamie, cover for me, I said as I was already rounding the bar, and my voice came out too steady for someone about to do something completely insane. Jamie opened her mouth to protest, but I was already pushing through the door, and the cold February night air hit my face like a slap that woke me up completely. My sneakers hit the asphalt in a quick, steady rhythm as I crossed the street, and each step seemed to amplify the sound of my own pulse hammering in my ears. The restaurant had that atmosphere of old money and even older secrets, with low lights and waiters who knew exactly when not to look at certain tables. I pushed through the glass door, and the maitre d' started approaching with that professional smile that said, "You don't have a reservation and you don't belong here." But I walked right past him because there was no time for explanations or excuses. Hector was 3 tables away, and he wore a suit that probably cost more than 6 months of my rent. And there were 2 men sitting with him discussing something that made their expressions hard and tense. I caught fragments of the conversation as I approached. "Boss, Lindsay Marconi's pushing into South Territory," one of the associates was saying, and Hector responded with that controlled voice. "Lindsay is a problem I'll deal with later, right now," but he didn't finish the sentence because that's when I reached the table. I approached, and Hector's 2 associates looked up at me with that kind of sharp attention that dangerous men reserve for potential threats, but it was Hector who really saw me. His eyes were dark as unsweetened coffee, and examined me from head to toe in a second that seemed to last an eternity, and then he spoke in a voice that had that low, controlled quality of someone who never needed to shout to be obeyed. "Can I help you?" The question was polite, but there was a sharp edge underneath, and I knew that if I didn't act in the next 2 seconds, the shooter would have his perfect window. So I leaned over the table, bracing one hand on the cold marble and bringing my face dangerously close to his, and whispered fast enough that only he could hear, "Trust me." And then I kissed him, pressing my mouth against his with enough force to be convincing, and positioning myself so that my body completely blocked the shooter's view of him through the window. Hector's body went rigid for a fraction of a second, but then something changed, and he didn't push me away, didn't yell, didn't call the security guards who were certainly somewhere nearby. Instead, he stayed perfectly still and let me do what I needed to do, and I tasted whiskey and danger on his lips while I counted the 3 longest seconds of my life. In the building across the street, Jane Volkoff adjusted her aim, but the woman was completely in front of the target, blocking any clean shot. "Shit," she muttered, fingers tensing on the trigger. "Woman in front. Can't shoot without hitting her." Lindsay said Hector only. She waited 2 more seconds, but the woman didn't move. Abort. And then she disassembled the rifle and disappeared. When I finally pulled away, heart still hammering violently against my ribs, I saw confusion in Hector's dark eyes mixed with something that looked like dangerous curiosity. The 2 associates were gaping, and one of them had his hand inside his jacket, probably touching a gun. But Hector raised his hand in a minimal gesture that made them freeze. "Sorry about that," I said, and my voice came out shakier than I would have liked, so I took a deep breath and pointed at the window with a controlled movement of my head. "But you were about to die. Shooter in the building across the street." Reflection in the glass of the 3rd window. "He's gone now because I blocked his view, and professional shooters don't risk hitting the wrong target." Hector followed my gaze to the window, and for a moment something dangerous and calculated passed across his face, as if he were processing information and making connections faster than most people could. Then he looked back at me, and the intensity of those dark eyes made something strange twist in my stomach. "How did you know?" The question was simple, but loaded with layers I wasn't sure I was ready to unpack, and I swallowed hard before responding. "Training." That was all I said, and I saw the exact moment his mind caught that word and began analyzing it from every possible angle. "You should get out of here now, in case he comes back or has backup waiting." Hector didn't take his eyes off me as he spoke, but his voice cut through the air with absolute authority when he addressed the man sitting to his right. "Logan, we're leaving now." The man called Logan stood immediately, and only then did I realize how big and intimidating he was, with broad shoulders and a thin scar cutting through his left eyebrow. Hector stood too, adjusting his jacket cuffs in a casual movement that completely contradicted the tension of the moment, and then his hand wrapped around my wrist firmly, but without brutality. "You're coming with me." It wasn't a request, and the way his fingers closed around my skin sent a strange heat up my arm, and I knew I should protest, should refuse, should go back to the bar and pretend none of this had happened. But there was something in his eyes that held me in place, something that said this wasn't a suggestion I could simply ignore. I started to say, but he cut me off with a look that was part command and part silent plea, and that disarmed me more than any threat could have. "You saved me, and I need to understand how and why, not a request." His hand was still around my wrist, warm and firm, and I felt my resistance crumble because deep down I knew he was right. Whoever had tried to kill him would eventually discover that I had interfered, and when that happened, I would become a target too. "Okay," I finally said, and the word came out in a sigh of surrender that I wasn't sure was about the situation or about the way he was looking at me. The car was parked on the side street and was exactly the kind of vehicle a man like Hector Ricci would drive, black and gleaming and probably armored enough to withstand a missile attack. Logan got in the driver's seat, while Hector opened the back door for me, with an old-fashioned courtesy that contrasted strangely with the implicit violence of the entire situation. I slid into the soft leather interior, and he got in behind me, closing the door with a definitive click that seemed to seal some kind of unspoken agreement between us. The car started moving, and Logan looked in the rearview mirror with an expression that mixed curiosity and professional distrust. "Boss, who is she?" The question hung in the dense air of the car, and I felt the weight of Hector's gaze on me even before I turned my head to face him. "Good question," Hector said, and there was a tone of dark humor in his voice that made my skin tingle. Then he turned completely in my direction, and the proximity and the confined space of the back seat made the air seem thicker. "Who are you?" "Jody Russo," I answered, and it was strange to say my real name out loud to someone from this world after 5 years pretending to be just a regular bartender. "I work at the bar across from the restaurant." A bartender who identifies professional shooters in 3 seconds and acts without hesitation. Hector tilted his head, and the light from the street lamps passing by the window drew interesting shadows on his angular face. "Try again, and this time give me the truth." I sighed and let my head fall back against the seat, because there was no point in lying now that I'd already gotten completely involved in this mess. "Okay, the truth. I was involved with the Mafia in the past. My father was Anthony Russo." The silence that followed was so absolute that I could hear the sound of my own breathing, and then Logan almost crashed the car into the curb and had to make a sharp correction that threw us to the side. "Anthony Russo?" Logan's voice came out in a high-pitched tone of shock that would have been funny under other circumstances. "The strategist? The man who planned the port operation in 2018? That's the one," I confirmed, and I couldn't avoid the little point of pride that always surfaced when people spoke of my father with that kind of reverence. "He trained me in everything: observation, strategy, hand-to-hand combat. He wanted me to be able to survive in this world even as a woman, so he taught me everything he knew from the time I was old enough to hold a gun. Hector was studying me with an intensity that made my stomach turn in ways that had nothing to do with fear, and when he spoke, his voice had that low, dangerous quality that made the words feel like both a caress and a threat. "You're Anthony Russo's daughter." It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway, and I saw something shift in his dark eyes. "And where is he now?" "Dead for 5 years," I said, and the words still hurt even after all this time, like a wound that had never really healed. Stray bullet during a territorial war. I was 23 and watched him die in my arms, and that's when I decided I didn't want anything to do with this life anymore. Changed my name, got a normal job, pretended to be a regular person, until today, when I saw you about to die, and my father's training just took over. "Why did you save me?" Hector asked, and there was a strange vulnerability in that question that didn't fit with the image of an all-powerful mafia boss. "You don't even know me?" I turned to really look at him, and realized we were sitting dangerously close to each other in the back seat, so close that I could see the small lines around his eyes and feel the heat emanating from his body. Because my father always said that information is power, and that saving the right life can change everything, and you're important, powerful, influential. I couldn't let you die and watch the city turn into a battlefield because of a succession war. Something passed through Hector's eyes that I couldn't completely decipher, but that made my pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with the danger of the situation. "You're incredible," he said, and the words came out in a reverent tone that caught me completely by surprise. "And dangerous in a way I didn't expect." "Ex-dangerous," I corrected, trying to maintain some kind of control over the situation even with him looking at me like that. "Now I just make drinks and try to live a normal life." "Lie." The word was said with so much conviction that it made me blink in surprise, and Hector leaned even closer, completely invading my personal space in a way that should have made me pull back, but instead left me paralyzed. "You never stop being what your father trained you to be, Jody Russo. The training is in your blood, in the way you observe everything around you, in the way you calculated exactly what to do to save me without causing panic. You can pretend to be just a bartender, but your body knows the truth." He was right, and I hated how right he was, because part of me would always miss the adrenaline and clarity of this world, even knowing how much it had cost me. "Where do I live?" I asked, changing the subject because I wasn't ready to admit that truth out loud. "Why?" Hector responded with another question, and there was something calculated in the way he was observing me, as if he were assembling a complex puzzle in his mind. "Because whoever tried to kill you will eventually discover that I interfered," I said, voicing the fear that had been growing in my chest since the moment I decided to act. "And when that happens, the target is me." "Exactly." The word came out in a dark tone that sent a shiver down my spine, and then Hector reached out and took my chin between his fingers, turning my face to force our eyes to meet. The touch was firm, but surprisingly gentle, and the heat of his skin against mine made something strange happen in my stomach. "So you stay with me, under my protection, until I figure out who tried to kill me and eliminate the threat completely." "I don't need protection," I protested, but the words came out without much conviction, because we both knew a professional shooter was different from a street fight. Hector smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had nothing of humor and everything of dangerous promise. "You saved my life, and now I'm going to save yours." "Not a request, it's an order." His fingers were still on my chin, and I was dangerously aware of how easy it would be to close the distance between us and find out if that emergency kiss had been as intense as my memory insisted. "And maybe I just want you close to figure out who you really are underneath that normal bartender facade." My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it, and when I spoke, my voice came out huskier than intended. "Okay, but only until the threat passes." "Of course," Hector said, and then released my chin and leaned back in the seat. But the small smile playing on his lips told me he knew exactly the effect he had on me. "She's not going to want to leave after," he thought, and there was absolute certainty in that silent thought, as if he already knew how this story would end before I even realized it had begun. I looked out the window and realized we were leaving the city behind, driving toward the wealthy suburbs where men like Hector Ricci kept their fortresses, and I wondered exactly what kind of mess I'd gotten myself into by deciding to save his life with a kiss. Yeah, I guess it's going to get complicated now for Jody to forget her Mafia past. Chapter 2, Mansion and Short Pajamas.
"You're dangerous, Jody."
Hector Ricci's mansion was exactly the kind of place I'd expect from a man with his power and influence. All dark stone and huge windows that probably cost more than most entire houses. And when we passed through the wrought iron gates, I felt that familiar tightness in my chest that always came when I remembered that this life had never really let me go. Logan parked the car in a garage that looked like it could fit about 10 vehicles, and all of them were equally expensive and intimidating. And when Hector opened my door and extended his hand to help me out, I hesitated only a second before accepting, because refusing would seem childish, and I wasn't that scared girl from 5 years ago anymore. "Guest room is on the second floor," Hector said, as he guided me through hallways that looked like they came straight out of an architecture magazine, with high ceilings and artwork that probably cost a fortune hanging on the walls like they were common things. "I'll send someone to get your clothes from your apartment, so give me your address and keys." I blinked in surprise because I didn't expect him to be so practical and efficient about this, but then I realized that men like Hector Ricci didn't get to the top by being indecisive or slow. "I can go get my own things," I said, but the way he stopped walking and turned to look at me with that expression that clearly said this wasn't open for negotiation made me swallow the rest of my protest. "You can, but you won't," he responded, and there was a firmness in his voice that left no room for arguments. "Whoever tried to kill me might be watching your apartment waiting for you to come back, and I'm not going to risk your safety because of pride." He moved closer, invading my personal space again in that way that made my pulse quicken, and when he spoke his voice had that low quality that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "Give me the address, Jody. Please." The word please sounded strange coming from him, as if it wasn't something he said frequently, and it disarmed me enough that I gave in and pulled the keys from the purse that was still hanging on my shoulder. "Apartment 4B, I murmured as I handed over the keys, and our fingers touched briefly, sending that strange heat up my arm again. Hector took the keys and called someone on the phone with quick, precise instructions, and then turned his attention completely back to me in a way that made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered at that moment. The guest room was absurdly luxurious, with a king-size bed that looked more comfortable than anything I'd ever slept in, and a private bathroom with a bathtub that could easily fit 3 people. Hector showed me where everything was with that casual efficiency of someone who was used to being the perfect host, and then stopped at the door, as if he were waiting for something that I didn't quite know what it was. "If you need anything, my room is at the end of the hall," he said, and there was something in the way he said those words that made my mind imagine things I definitely shouldn't be imagining. "And Jody, thank you for saving me today. I haven't said this properly yet, but you're exceptional." And then he left before I could respond, closing the door softly behind him and leaving me alone in a strange room with my heart beating much faster than it should. The following hours passed in a kind of strange fog where I bathed in the giant tub and tried to process everything that had happened in the last 4 hours. And when my clothes arrived, brought by a silent man who didn't make eye contact, I put on my usual pajamas and tried to sleep in the absurdly comfortable bed. But sleep didn't come, because my mind couldn't stop replaying that kiss at the restaurant, and the way Hector had looked at me in the car, as if he were trying to decipher all my secrets at once. At 2 a.m, I gave up trying to sleep, and decided that maybe a glass of water would help. So I left the room barefoot, and silent the way my father taught me to walk, when I didn't want to be detected. I was wearing my normal pajamas, that cotton shorts set that barely covered half my thighs, and a thin tank top that showed everything because I never wore a bra to sleep. And it didn't occur to me that it would be a problem, because I thought everyone would be asleep at this hour of the morning. The mansion's kitchen was the size of my entire apartment, all marble and stainless steel appliances that gleamed under the soft lights that turned on automatically when I entered, and I opened the giant refrigerator looking for water, while my loose hair fell over my shoulders, and the cold air made my skin break out in goosebumps, in a way that definitely made my nipples even more evident under the thin tank top. That's when I heard the voice behind me, deep and hoarse, in a way that made something tighten low in my belly. "Can't sleep?" Hector asked, and when I turned around quickly, the water bottle almost slipped from my hand because he was standing in the kitchen entrance wearing only gray sweatpants that hung dangerously low on his hips and nothing else. And his bare chest was a work of art of defined muscles and some scars that told stories I probably didn't want to know. His eyes traveled down my body in a slow, deliberate movement that made my skin heat up, and when they returned to my face there was something dark and intense in them that made my heart race. "Sorry," the words came out in a rushed stream as I tried uselessly to cover myself with one arm, too aware of how that ridiculously short pajama exposed me. "I didn't know you were awake. I just wanted water and didn't expect to see anyone." I stopped talking, because Hector was approaching with those controlled predator steps, and every inch he gained made the air between us thicker and more charged. "It's okay, the house is yours too," he said, but his voice came out hoarser than normal, and I saw the effort it cost him to keep his eyes on my face instead of letting them wander over my semi-exposed body. He stopped just a meter away, and ran his hand through his dark hair, in a gesture that seemed more nervous than anything I'd ever seen him do, and then his eyes betrayed his intention, and dropped down again quickly before returning. That pajama is small. I bit my lower lip and felt my face heat up because he wasn't wrong, and I felt exposed and vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with physical danger. I sleep like this normally. Didn't expect to have an audience at 2 a.m, I replied, and tried to make it sound like a joke, but my voice came out too shaky to be convincing. The way Hector was looking at me made me feel like I was being devoured alive, and the scariest part was that I didn't completely hate the feeling. Hector took another step in my direction, and now was close enough for me to feel the heat emanating from his bare body. And when he spoke, his voice had that dangerous quality that made my entire skin tingle. "Well, now you have an audience," he said, and his dark eyes traveled over my body again without any pretense of disguising it. "And I'm trying really hard to be respectful here, Jody, but you're making it incredibly difficult when you show up in my kitchen wearing practically nothing." My breath failed and came out in a broken sigh that made his eyes narrow slightly, and I knew I should back away, should put distance between us before we did something neither of us was ready to do. But my feet seemed glued to the cold kitchen floor, and all I could do was look at him and wonder if it would be so terrible to close that ridiculous distance and find out if his lips tasted the same as I remembered from the kiss at the restaurant. "Hector," his name came out in a hoarse whisper, and I didn't even know what I was trying to say. If it was a protest or an invitation, or just an acknowledgement of the impossible situation we found ourselves in. He extended his hand, and his fingers touched my chin with that surprising gentleness that completely contrasted with the intensity in his gaze, turning my face up to force our eyes to meet. "You saved me today," he said, and his voice came out in a low tone that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. "Kissed me in front of everyone without thinking twice, and now you're in my house wearing pajamas that barely cover you." His fingers slid from my chin to the side of my neck, in a touch so light it could have been my imagination, but the heat was too real to be just fantasy. "Are you testing me, Jody? Because I have limits and you're pushing all of them at the same time." "No, it was an accident," I protested, but the words came out with no conviction, because the way my body was reacting to his proximity suggested that maybe it wasn't so accidental after all. "I didn't know you were awake, and I just came to get water," and I stopped talking when his thumb passed over my pulse in a movement so subtle it made my entire skin break out in goosebumps. "Dangerous accidents," Hector murmured, and then finally pulled away, taking a step back that seemed to cost more effort than it should. The loss of his body heat was almost physical, and I had to hold myself back from taking a step forward and closing the distance again. "Go back to your room, Jody, before I forget you're my guest and do something we're both not ready to deal with the consequences of." My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it, and when I spoke, my voice came out in a trembling thread that barely sounded like mine. "Okay, good night, Hector." I started walking toward the door but stopped when he spoke again, and this time there was a touch of dark humor in his voice that made something tighten in my chest. "Good night, Jody. And please, wear something more tomorrow." The word "more" was emphasized in a way that made it very clear exactly what he meant, and I felt my face heat up again as I practically fled the kitchen with my forgotten water bottle in hand. As I climbed the stairs with my heart still racing, I heard a low sound coming from the kitchen, almost like a frustrated groan, and then Hector's voice murmuring to himself in a tone of absolute resignation. "She's going to kill me." Back in my room, I closed the door and leaned against it, trying to control my accelerated breathing and the heat that still coursed through my entire body. I had sworn 5 years ago that I would never get involved with this world again, that I would keep my distance from dangerous men and impossible situations. But here I was in the mansion of the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast, wearing ridiculously short pajamas and wanting things I definitely shouldn't want. The bed was still empty and inviting, but I knew sleep would be impossible now, not after that electric tension in the kitchen and the way Hector had looked at me, as if he wanted to devour me and protect me at the same time. I lay down anyway, and pulled the covers up to my chin, even though it was warm, and tried not to think about how easy it would be to walk down the hall to his room and find out exactly where that tension could lead us. My phone vibrated on the nightstand, and when I picked it up, I saw a message from Jamie, asking if I was okay and where the hell I had gone, and for a moment I considered telling her everything, but then I realized I wouldn't even know where to start. "I'm fine. I'll explain tomorrow," I typed back, and then turned off the phone because I wasn't ready for the inevitable questions she would ask. The silence of the mansion was different from the silence of my small apartment, deeper and somehow heavier, as if the walls held secrets I probably would never know. I closed my eyes and tried to empty my mind, but all I saw was Hector shirtless in the kitchen with that look that promised dangerous things, and the way his fingers had touched my chin with a gentleness that completely contradicted the intensity in the rest of his body. Eventually, exhaustion won over mental agitation, and I fell into a restless sleep full of fragmented dreams where I kissed Hector again, but this time, it wasn't to save him from a shooter, but because I wanted to feel those lips on mine and find out if reality would be as intense as memory insisted. When I woke up a few hours later with the morning sun coming through the curtains I had forgotten to close, the first thing I thought was that I needed to find more appropriate pajamas if I was going to stay there for any length of time. The second thing I thought was that Hector Ricci was dangerous in a completely different way from shooters and Mafia wars, because he was making me want things I was sure would only bring complications. And the third thing, the one that scared me more than all the others, was that part of me didn't care one bit about the complications if it meant feeling that intensity again. I got up and went to the bathroom, carefully avoiding looking in the mirror because I wasn't ready to confront the mess my hair probably was. And when I finally looked at myself, I saw that my eyes were brighter than they should be, and there was a flush on my cheeks that had nothing to do with the room temperature. "You're in trouble, Jody," I murmured to my reflection, and the girl in the mirror agreed with a small, trembling smile that confirmed exactly how much trouble I really was in. "Jody's in trouble, but it looks like she's enjoying this excitement a little too, huh?" Chapter 3: Investigation and Chemistry.
Let's take it slow.
Morning arrived with a golden light that invaded my room through the open curtains, and I woke up with that strange feeling of not immediately recognizing where I was until the memories from the night before all came back at once. The kiss at the restaurant, the car, the mansion, and especially that encounter in the kitchen at 2 a.m. that still made my skin heat up just remembering it. I showered and put on jeans and a long-sleeved blouse that covered practically everything, because the last thing I needed was to give Hector more reasons to look at me in that way that made my stomach flip. And when I went down to the kitchen following the smell of fresh coffee, I found Logan sitting at the table with a cup in his hand, and a serious expression that immediately told me something important had happened. "Good morning," I said, and my voice came out more hesitant than I intended, because Logan was intimidating in a different way from Hector, more direct and less controlled, as if he didn't care as much about hiding what he thought. He nodded in silent greeting and pointed at the coffee maker in a mute offer, and I accepted because I definitely needed caffeine to process everything that was happening in my life in the last 24 hours. That's when Hector entered the kitchen, and he was wearing a dark gray suit that probably cost more than my entire car, and made his eyes seem even more intense. And when our gazes met for a second, something passed between us that made the air thick and charged in that way I was starting to recognize as being just ours. He looked away first, and turned to Logan with that commanding posture that made it clear that now was business time, and I sat down on one of the stools at the kitchen island trying to seem invisible, while holding my coffee cup like it was an anchor. "Report," Hector said, and his voice had that sharp quality of a boss that I hadn't yet heard directed at someone else, and Logan straightened slightly before responding with the efficiency of someone who had done this type of report 1,000 times before. "Boss, shooter was Jane Volkov, hired by Lindsay Marconi." The words fell into the kitchen air like stones in a lake, creating waves of tension that I could feel even without looking directly at Hector. And when I finally raised my eyes, I saw that his face had become hard and dangerous in a way that reminded me exactly why he was the most powerful man on the East Coast. "Lindsay," Hector said, and the name came out in a low tone that had more threat than if he had shouted. I knew it. There was a pause where he took a sip of the coffee Logan had prepared for him, and I saw the muscles in his jaw tighten before he continued. "Where is he?" "Hiding, but we'll find him," Logan responded with absolute confidence that suggested this was just a matter of time and not possibility. "I have people tracking his usual spots, and some contacts gave us leads on possible hideouts." He paused and took another sip of his own coffee, before adding the information that made my stomach clench. "And Jane?" "Disappeared," Logan said, and the way he briefly looked in my direction told me the next part was about me even before he spoke. "But if Lindsay hired her once, he'll hire her again, this time for Jody." The fury that passed across Hector's face was so intense, I almost instinctively backed away, but then I realized it wasn't directed at me, but at the threat hanging over my head, like a sword about to fall. "Nobody touches her," he said, and the words came out in an absolute tone that left no room for doubt or discussion, as if it were a divine decree he expected the universe to obey without question. Logan studied Hector for a moment, too long to be casual, and then asked the question that had obviously been burning on his tongue since the night before. "Boss, are you interested in her?" The silence that followed was so charged I could feel the weight of it on my shoulders, and I kept my eyes fixed on my coffee cup, as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world, because I definitely wasn't ready to see the answer on Hector's face. "Maybe," Hector finally responded, and the word came out in a careful tone that suggested he was weighing each syllable before letting it out. "She's different, smart, brave." There was a pause, and then he added in a lower tone that made something tighten in my chest. "And beautiful." My heart skipped a beat. and I risked a look in his direction and found his dark eyes already fixed on me with that intensity that made my entire skin tingle. Logan cleared his throat in a way that suggested he was uncomfortable being witness to that moment, but continued talking anyway because apparently he had more important things to say. "And Anthony Russo's daughter," Logan added, and there was obvious respect in the way he said my father's name. "Legend, that too," Hector agreed, but his eyes didn't leave me when he spoke, as if he were seeing through all the layers I had built over the last 5 years. There was another pause, and then he turned completely to Logan, with a clear order in his voice. "Protect her like she's mine." The word mine resonated in the air between us like a bell being rung, and I swallowed hard, trying to process exactly what that meant, and whether I should feel offended or protected or some strange mixture of both. Logan, however, didn't seem the least bit surprised, and simply asked the obvious question that was hanging in the air. "Is she yours already?" The question had layers of meaning I wasn't sure I wanted to unpack, and when Hector responded, his voice had that quality of absolute certainty that made simple statements sound like prophecies. "Not yet," he said, and then his eyes met mine again with a silent promise that made my pulse quicken. "But she will be." Logan nodded as if that explained everything, and got up from the table with his empty cup, muttering something about having work to do before leaving the kitchen, and leaving us alone in an atmosphere that suddenly seemed too thick to breathe properly. Hector approached the island where I was sitting, and braced his hands on the marble on the opposite side, leaning slightly in my direction, in a way that made the space between us seem simultaneously too large and dangerously small. "Have plans for lunch?" he asked, and the casual question contrasted strangely with the intensity in his gaze, as if we were having two conversations at the same time, one with words and another with everything that wasn't being said. "Considering I'm basically under house arrest because of the shooter," I replied, trying to inject some humor into the situation even with my heart hammering against my ribs. No specific plans. "Have lunch with me then," he said, and it wasn't exactly a request, but also wasn't an order. It was somewhere in the middle where I could technically refuse, but we both knew I wouldn't. "There's a terrace in the back overlooking the garden. Private safe, and I think we need to talk." The hours until lunch passed in a kind of fog, where I tried to read a book I found in the mansion's library, but couldn't concentrate, because my mind kept returning to that conversation in the kitchen, and the way Hector had said, "But she will be," as if my future was already decided, and I just needed to reach the same conclusion. When noon finally arrived and I went upstairs to change clothes, I chose a simple summer dress that was pretty without being provocative, because I was learning fast that provoking Hector Ricci was playing with fire. I wasn't sure I was ready to control. The terrace was exactly as beautiful as I imagined it would be, with an elegantly set table and a view of a garden that looked like it came out of a landscaping magazine, and Hector was already there when I arrived, having changed the suit for dress pants and a white shirt with sleeves rolled up to his elbows that somehow made him look more dangerous instead of more casual. He pulled out the chair for me, with that old-fashioned courtesy I was starting to associate with him, and when I sat down, I felt the warmth of his hand briefly brush my back before pulling away. The food arrived, brought by silent staff, who quickly disappeared, leaving us alone again. And for a few minutes, we ate in silence while I tried to gather courage to start the conversation we both knew needed to happen. It was Hector who broke the silence first, setting down his silverware and looking at me with that focused intensity that made me feel like I was the only thing in his world at that moment. "Tell me about your father," he said, and his voice came out gentle in a way that contrasted with the hardness I had seen in the kitchen earlier. "About the training, about how you two were together." So I took a deep breath and started talking, telling him about how my father had been simultaneously the most dangerous and gentlest man I knew, how he taught me to shoot when I was 10, and took me for ice cream afterward. How he insisted on training me in everything he knew, because he said the world was cruel to women in this business, and he wanted me to be able to defend myself. I talked about his last moments, about how he had died in my arms during a stupid territorial war over a piece of territory that wasn't even worth it, and how his last words were for me to get out of this life and find something better. Hector listened to everything without interrupting, and when I finished I saw something like understanding in his dark eyes, as if he understood exactly the weight of carrying the legacy of someone you loved and lost. "He sounds like he was a good father," Hector finally said, and there was genuine respect in his voice that made something tighten in my chest, even being who he was, even living the life he lived. Then it was his turn to speak, telling me about how he built his empire from scratch after his father died, leaving debts and enemies, about the difficult choices he had to make and the people he lost along the way. And as he spoke, I realized we had more in common than would be comfortable to admit. The silence that followed after we both finished speaking was different from the previous one, more comfortable, and charged with a mutual understanding that wasn't there before. That's when Hector asked the question I knew would come eventually, but still wasn't completely prepared to answer. "Do you want to go back to this life?" he asked, and there was something vulnerable in the way he looked at me, as if my answer mattered more than it should to someone I'd known for less than 24 hours. "No," I replied with a firmness that came from 5 years of absolute conviction. "I left for a reason. I watched my father die because of this life, and I don't want that for myself." The words came out harsher than I intended, and I saw something pass through Hector's eyes that could have been disappointment, or maybe just understanding. "What if I promised you'd be safe with me?" The question came soft, but loaded with meaning, and I shook my head because he wasn't getting the point. "Hector, this isn't about safety," I said, and I put my hand on the table in a gesture of emphasis. "It's about not wanting this life, the danger, the violence, never knowing if I'll wake up tomorrow or if someone I love will be alive at the end of the day." "I understand," he said, and by the way his shoulders relaxed slightly, I believed he really understood, even if he didn't like the answer. There was a long pause where he seemed to be considering his next words carefully, and then he leaned in my direction with that focused intensity that made my heart race. "But what if it was about us? Not about the Mafia, not about this life, just about you and me exploring whatever this is that's happening between us." My heart raced and I felt my breath catch, because that completely changed the conversation from safe territory to dangerous waters I didn't know if I was ready to navigate. "Us?" The word came out in a trembling whisper, and I saw the small smile that touched his lips before he responded. "I feel something for you, Jody," Hector said, and the raw honesty in his voice completely disarmed me. "Since that kiss, since you saved me without even thinking twice, and I want to explore this. I want to find out what it could be if we let it happen." "I feel it too," I finally admitted, and the words came out easier than I expected, even carrying the weight of everything they implied. "But I'm scared." The confession hung between us like a fragile bridge that could break at any moment. "Of me?" Hector asked, and there was genuine vulnerability in the question that made my heart clench. "Of going back," I replied, and I let the honesty flow because he deserved at least that. "Of losing control, of falling in love with a dangerous man, and waking up one day, realizing I became exactly what I swore I'd never be again." Hector extended his hand across the table and took mine with that surprising gentleness that contrasted with everything he was, and when our fingers intertwined, I felt that familiar heat rise up my arm and spread through my entire chest. "Then we'll take it slow," he said, and his voice came out firm and promising. "Explore without pressure, without expectations beyond seeing where this takes us. I won't force you into my life if you don't want it, but I also won't pretend I don't want you in it." I looked at our intertwined hands, and then at his dark eyes watching me with that intensity that was already becoming familiar, and I realized I was on the edge of something that could change everything or destroy me completely, and the scariest part was that I wanted to jump anyway. "Okay," I finally said, and the word came out in a sigh of surrender. "Slow." The smile that lit up Hector's face was small but genuine, and he lifted my hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss on my fingers that made my stomach do a complete flip. "Slow," he repeated, as if sealing a promise. And in that moment on the sunny terrace with our hands intertwined and the garden stretching out around us, I allowed in the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't end in disaster. Chapter 4. Jane attacks and Jody fights.
I'm always ready.
A week had passed since that lunch on the terrace where Hector and I decided to explore whatever it was that was growing between us. And the days had fallen into a strangely comfortable routine where I spent mornings reading in the library while he worked in his office and afternoons talking about everything and nothing at the same time, learning each other in slow layers that made that connection deeper with each passing day. But as luxurious and safe as the mansion was, I was starting to miss the outside world. And especially Jamie, who had sent me approximately 50 messages asking if I was alive and when the hell I was going to show up to explain what was happening. That's why when I came down for breakfast that Thursday morning, I had already decided I needed to get out, even if just for a few hours. And when I found Hector in the kitchen drinking coffee and reading something on his tablet with that focused concentration that made a crease appear between his eyebrows, I took a deep breath and spoke before I could change my mind. "I need to go out today," I said, and my voice came out firmer than expected, considering I knew exactly how he would react to the idea of letting me leave the safety of the mansion. Hector looked up from the tablet and studied me for a long moment, and I saw the conflict pass across his face between the desire to keep me locked up and safe and the understanding that I wasn't a prisoner and would eventually need to get back to having some semblance of a normal life. "Where to?" he finally asked, and the tone was carefully neutral in a way that told me he was making an effort to not simply say no. "Visit Jamie at the bar," I replied, serving myself coffee and sitting on the stool across from him. She's my best friend and she's worried, and I need to at least show up and show her I'm alive before she calls the police or something worse. I tried to make it sound casual, but we both knew that going out meant risk, that Jane Volkov was still out there somewhere, and that Lindsay Marconi probably still wanted us both dead. With security, Hector said, and it wasn't a question but a non-negotiable condition, and I nodded because honestly I expected at least that. Marcus will go with you. He's the best I have, ex-military, trained in high-risk protection. He paused and looked at me with that intensity that made my stomach flip. And you don't leave his sight for even a second. Understood? Understood, I agreed, and tried not to think about how strange it was to need a bodyguard to visit my best friend at a bar where I used to work. Hector made a quick call, and a few minutes later, a huge man with a stern face appeared in the kitchen, and Marcus had that ex-military way that Hector had described, perfectly upright posture, and eyes that seemed to catalog all possible threats within a 50-meter radius. The trip to the bar was too calm, and that made me more nervous than it should because I learned from my father that the calm before the storm is always the most dangerous part. Marcus drove with professional efficiency and parked in a spot with good visibility of all exits, and when we got out of the car, he stayed 2 steps behind me, but close enough to intervene against any threat, and I tried to ignore how strange it was to have a human shadow following me as I walked down the familiar sidewalk toward the bar where I had worked for 3 years. Jamie was wiping down glasses when I entered, exactly like I was doing a week ago when I saw the rifle reflection, and when she looked up and saw me, the expression on her face went through approximately 5 different emotions before settling on relief mixed with exasperation. "Jody, finally, I thought you had..." She stopped mid-sentence when Marcus entered behind me, and her eyes widened slightly before returning to me with an expression that clearly said we needed to talk. "Hi, Jamie," I said, trying to sound normal, despite the giant bodyguard standing near the door like a threatening statue. "Sorry for disappearing like that. I can explain." But I didn't get to finish the explanation, because that's when I heard the sound. A muffled noise coming from outside that my training immediately identified as a silencer, and my blood froze because I knew exactly what that meant. Marcus fell before he could even pull his weapon, and blood spread across the clean bar floor in a pool that grew too fast, and Jamie screamed, but the sound seemed to come from very far away, because all my focus was on the woman who entered through the door with fluid predator movements, dark hair tied in a ponytail, and cold eyes that assessed me with the efficiency of someone who had killed enough people to not feel anything doing it anymore. "Jody Russo," Jane Volkov said, and her voice came out calm and professional, as if we were discussing the weather, and not the fact that she was clearly there to kill me. "Lindsay sends his regards." Her hand moved to the gun attached to her waist, but I was already moving too, because my father hadn't trained me for years, so I would freeze in the moment that mattered. I kicked the nearest table in her direction, and the movement made her dodge for a fraction of a second, enough time for me to close the distance between us and grab her wrist before the gun came completely out of the holster. The fight that followed was brutal and elegant at the same time. 2 trained bodies moving in a violent ballet of strikes and counter-strikes, and I tasted copper in my mouth when her elbow hit my lip, but I rolled and managed to force the gun away from her hands. Jane was good, better than most of the men my father had put me up against for training, but I had grown up fighting against bigger and stronger men, and had learned to use physics and strategy where brute strength was lacking. When she tried a right hook, I dodged and caught her arm, spinning my body and using her momentum against herself, and the sound of bone breaking was loud and satisfying in the tense silence of the bar. Jane screamed and fell to her knees, her arm hanging at the wrong angle, and I picked up her gun from the floor where it had fallen and pointed it directly at her head, with hands that didn't tremble at all, despite the adrenaline running through my veins like liquid fire. "Who hired you?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer because I needed to hear the confirmation. "Lindsay?" Jane laughed, and the sound came out choppy from the pain, but still had that quality of dark amusement that made her seem slightly insane. "Yes," she said, holding her broken arm against her chest. "He wants you dead, for saving Hector, for ruining his plans. Tell him he'll have to try harder," I replied, and my voice came out cold and controlled in a way that would have made my father proud, because that's exactly how he had taught me to speak to enemies, without emotion and with absolute promise of violence if necessary. "He will," Jane said, and her eyes gleamed with something that could have been respect, or maybe just recognition of an equal. "And next time, you're not ready." "I'm always ready," I said, and then used the gun butt against her temple in a calculated blow to knock out without killing, because as much as she had tried to kill me, I wasn't a murderer, and my father always said that killing only when absolutely necessary was what separated professionals from psychopaths. Jane fell to the floor unconscious, and I finally allowed my hands to tremble slightly as I lowered the gun and looked at Jamie, who was crouched behind the bar with eyes wide with shock. That's when I heard the cars arriving too fast, tires screeching on the asphalt, and my entire body went tense, preparing for more fighting, until I recognized the black SUV that Hector had used to bring me here a week ago. The door opened before the car even stopped completely, and Hector got out with an urgency I had never seen in him before, his eyes sweeping the bar quickly until they found me, and the expression of absolute relief that passed across his face when he saw I was standing and unharmed made something strange happen in my chest. He entered the bar, and his eyes catalogued the scene in a second. Marcus dead near the door, Jane unconscious on the floor with a broken arm, me standing holding her gun with blood on my lip, but alive, and apparently in control of the situation. "You beat her?" Hector asked, and there was a mixture of impression and something darker in his eyes that made my skin heat up, despite everything that had just happened. "Yes," I replied, and finally lowered the gun because he was here, and I could allow my muscles to relax a bit. "She's good, but I'm better. My father trained me." The words came out with a pride I didn't know I still felt, because I had spent 5 years trying to forget everything my father had taught me, but now that training had saved my life, and I couldn't deny the value of it. Hector approached me with measured steps, and his eyes traveled over my body looking for injuries, and when his fingers touched my chin, turning my face to examine the injured lip, I felt that familiar heat rise up my skin. "You're hurt," he said, and his voice came out in a low tone that had more emotion than he probably intended to show. "I'm fine," I replied, and placed my hand over his where it still touched my face. "It's just a cut. I've had worse." Logan entered then with more men behind him, and the efficiency with which they began cleaning the scene told me this wasn't the first time they had done this kind of work, and I tried not to think too much about the implications of that. Hector turned me completely toward him, and his hands went to my shoulders, holding firmly, but not forcefully, and when he spoke, his voice had that quality of absolute command that left no room for arguments. "But Hector, Lindsay won't stop," I said before he could speak, because I needed him to understand the gravity of the situation. "He wants you dead, and now me too." "Then I'll end him," Hector said, and the words came out with an absolute finality that sent a shiver down my spine. "Today," he turned to Logan, who was supervising the removal of Marcus's body, and his voice cut through the air with authority. "Find Lindsay, now." "Already tracking him," Logan responded without looking up from the phone where he was apparently coordinating the search, and the cold efficiency with which everyone worked reminded me exactly what world I had re-entered, even if unintentionally. Hector turned his attention completely back to me and pulled my body against his, in an embrace that was simultaneously protective and possessive, and I felt my face pressed against his chest, where I could hear his heart beating too fast for someone who seemed so controlled. "You stay with me," he said against my hair, and his voice came out in a hoarse whisper that made my stomach flip. "Always. Until this is over. No exceptions. No arguments. I should have protested, should have insisted I could take care of myself as I had clearly just proven, but the truth was I was tired of fighting alone, and the idea of letting Hector protect me didn't seem as terrible as it should anymore. "Okay," I finally said against his chest, and I felt his muscles relax slightly at my agreement. Jamie approached hesitantly, still visibly shaken by what she had witnessed, and when our eyes met, I saw concern mixed with understanding in her gaze. "Go," she said, before I could apologize for bringing violence to her workplace. "Stay safe. We'll talk after all this is over." Hector guided me out of the bar with his hand firm on my back, and when we got into the SUV and Logan started driving back to the mansion, I let my head fall on his shoulder and allowed the events of the day to finally catch up with me. I had just fought for my life, had broken a professional assassin's arm, and had agreed to let the most dangerous man I knew protect me. And none of these things seemed real, but all were terribly true. "You were incredible," Hector murmured against my hair, and I felt the soft kiss he pressed on top of my head in a gesture so gentle it completely contrasted with the violence that had marked the last 30 minutes. And as we returned to the mansion with the promise that Lindsay Marconi would be eliminated today, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, all of this would end well in the end. The question for our protagonist is, will everything really end well? Chapter 5. Lindsay Confrontation and Possessiveness.
I'm not leaving.
Hector left the mansion before sunrise, and I woke up to the sound of the door closing and footsteps going down the stairs. My stomach clenched because I knew exactly what that meant. Knew that today was the day Lindsay Marconi would be confronted. I went to the window in time to see the convoy of black SUVs leaving through the gates, at least 4 vehicles full of armed men, and the reality of that life I had sworn to abandon came back with full force. The following hours dragged in torturous slowness. I tried to read, tried to eat, tried to do anything that would keep me from imagining 1,000 scenarios where Hector didn't come back. Logan had called only once to say, "We found him," and nothing more, and those 2 words made my heart race. The image of Hector injured kept coming back to my mind, and that's when I realized that in just 1 week, this man had become too important, that the idea of losing him made something hurt in my chest in a scary way. The warehouse where Lindsay was hiding was in the abandoned industrial district near the port. Hector got out of the SUV with Logan and 10 armed men spreading out in tactical formation, and when they entered the building, they found Lindsay with 8 men. The shootout was brief, but intense, gunfire echoing off the empty walls in a cacophony of controlled violence. In less than 10 minutes, 4 of Lindsay's men were dead, 3 wounded, and 1 had fled, leaving Lindsay completely exposed and surrounded. Lindsay Marconi was in his early 50s, graying hair and eyes that had seen enough violence to not be easily impressed. But when Hector approached with his gun in hand and that icy expression, something like genuine fear passed across his face. Hector's men forced Lindsay to his knees on the dirty floor with brutal efficiency, and Hector stood in front of him just watching with dark eyes that revealed nothing. "Why did you try to kill me?" Hector asked, and his voice came out too calm, controlled in a way more terrifying than any scream. Lindsay spat blood on the floor and looked up with a defiance that suggested he still had some pride. "Territory. Power," Lindsay responded in a hoarse voice. "You dominate too much. I wanted your downfall." The words came out without regret, just a statement of facts. Hector nodded as if the answer was exactly what he expected, and then asked the question that really mattered. "And Jody? Why try to kill her?" Lindsay laughed, and the sound came out wet and full of blood, but still had that quality of bitter amusement. "Because she saved you," he said, eyes gleaming with cruel understanding. "And I saw how you look at her. Saw it in the restaurant security footage. She's your weakness. Killing her would destroy you." The fury that passed across Hector's face was absolute and terrifying, transforming his features into something hard and dangerous that made even Logan step back. When he spoke, his voice came out in a low growl that made the air seem denser. "You were wrong," Hector said, and raised his gun, pointing at Lindsay's leg. "She's not weakness. She's strength." The shot echoed loudly, and Lindsay screamed when the bullet went through his thigh, blood instantly gushing. Hector lowered the gun slightly before continuing with that icy calm. "And you, never touch what's mine again. Understood?" Lindsay was holding his bleeding leg, face pale with pain, but managed to nod frantically. "Understood," he said through clenched teeth. "Good," Hector said, gesturing for his men to release Lindsay. "Now get out of the city and never come back, or the next shot." He pointed the gun at Lindsay's head for a second before lowering it. "Is fatal." Lindsay dragged himself across the floor, leaving a trail of blood, and his wounded men helped him out, while Hector watched with an icy expression that didn't change until they had completely disappeared. The sun was setting when Hector finally returned to the mansion. I was in the living room pretending to read when I heard the cars, and my heart raced with relief so intense it almost made me dizzy. I went to the entrance, arriving when Hector opened the door, and our eyes met. He was unharmed, maybe a little blood on his shirt, but it wasn't his, and something in my chest released. "Is it over?" The question came out in an urgent whisper. Hector closed the door and turned to me. "It's over." Lindsay fled, threat eliminated. The words were simple but carried the weight of everything that had happened. "So, can I go?" The words came out before I could think. "Go back to my life?" But even as I spoke, I felt something tighten in my chest, because the idea of leaving that mansion and Hector felt wrong. Hector remained motionless for a long moment. "Do you want to go?" he finally asked, and there was something vulnerable in the way he looked at me. The honesty of the question disarmed me, and I felt my throat tighten. The truth was, I didn't want to go, didn't want to return to my empty apartment. "No," I finally admitted, and the word came out in a trembling whisper. "But I thought you only wanted me here for protection." Hector approached with slow steps that made my heart race, and when he was close enough, he stopped and looked at me with that focused intensity that made the rest of the world disappear. "I want you here because I want you, period," he said, voice firm and clear. "Not for protection, for you." He raised his hand and touched my face with surprising gentleness, and when he continued, his voice had dropped to that low tone that vibrated through my body. "Stay with me, not as a guest, as mine." The word mine resonated in the air, and I felt my breath catch because that was declaration and request and promise all at the same time. The part of me that had spent 5 years building walls wanted to pull back, but the bigger part just wanted to say yes. "I'll stay," I finally said, voice firm despite my hammering heart. "But Hector, I'm not going back to the Mafia. I'm just staying with you. That's all I ask," Hector said, and then finally closed the distance and kissed me. This kiss was completely different from that one at the restaurant because it wasn't strategic or desperate. This kiss was real and intense and explosive. It was him wanting me and me wanting him, and when his lips touched mine, I felt something release in my chest. His hands went to my waist, pulling me closer as he deepened the kiss. and I wrapped my arms around his neck, pressing myself against his solid, warm body. The kiss tasted like promise and danger and possibility, and when we separated to breathe, we were both breathless. My lips swollen and heart beating so fast I was sure he could feel it. Mine, Hector murmured against my mouth before kissing me again. And this time, it was softer, but no less intense. When we stopped, he rested his forehead against mine, and we stayed like that for a long moment, just breathing the same air. Mine, I finally responded, testing the word and discovering I liked how it sounded. The smile that lit up Hector's face was small, but genuine, and made something tighten pleasantly in my chest. And there, standing in the mansion entrance with the sun setting outside, I allowed myself to believe that maybe I had found something worth all the risks. Chapter 6. Relationship and Acceptance.
I love you.
I love you too.
3 months had passed since that kiss at the mansion entrance that changed everything, and I woke up that May morning with the sun coming through the curtains of the room that was now ours, and no longer just the guest room where I had stayed that first week. Hector was still sleeping beside me, his face relaxed in a way it never was when he was awake, and I allowed myself a few moments just observing the way the morning light drew soft shadows on his features, before finally getting up carefully so as not to wake him. Life had fallen into a routine that was strangely perfect, considering how impossible everything seemed in the beginning. I lived with Hector, but maintained my independence in ways that mattered. He never pressured me to get involved in his business, and I never asked for details I didn't really want to know. It was a delicate balance, but it worked, because we both respected the lines the other had drawn, and somehow that brought us closer instead of creating distance. I had gone back to work at the bar 2 weeks after Lindsay fled the city, and Hector had insisted on discreet security that I pretended not to notice, even though I knew exactly which customers were actually his guards in disguise. Jamie had rolled her eyes when she figured it out, but didn't say anything, because she understood that was the price of being with me, and eventually even she got used to the silent presence of men who never ordered more than coffee and water during entire shifts. I went down to the kitchen and found Hector already awake. Apparently my movement in bed had been less careful than I thought, and he was making coffee wearing only sweatpants and nothing else, and my stomach still did that familiar flip every time I saw him so casual and domestic. He turned when he heard me enter, and the smile that lit up his face was small, but genuine, that kind of smile he only gave me, and that made my chest tighten pleasantly. "Good morning," he said, and his voice came out hoarse with sleep in a way that made heat rise up my skin. He approached and pulled me against his chest in a morning hug that had become our ritual, and I breathed deeply, smelling his scent that was a mixture of expensive soap and something that was just Hector. "Good morning," I replied against his chest, and we stayed like that for a long moment, just existing in each other's space, before the reality of the day pulled us toward responsibilities and obligations. He released me just enough to hand me a cup of coffee exactly the way I liked it, and that small gesture of attention still caught me off guard even after 3 months. The day passed quickly between work at the bar and returning home, which was now the mansion where I had finally allowed myself to put my own things, photographs and books, and small objects that made the enormous spaces feel more mine. Jamie had asked to come for dinner because she wanted to see how you're living this Mafia princess life, in her exact words, and Hector had agreed with that dry humor he only showed when he was really comfortable. Jamie arrived at 7 at night, driving her old car that contrasted absurdly with the luxury vehicles in the garage. And when I took her on a tour of the mansion, she kept alternating between impressed and slightly horrified by all the opulence. We ended up on the back porch with wine and that easy conversation that only best friends can have, and that's when she looked at me with that expression that said she was about to ask questions I might not want to answer. "Girl, you're glowing," Jamie finally said, and there was genuine admiration in her voice, mixed with something that could have been concern or just curiosity. I took a sip of wine, trying not to smile like an idiot, because she was right. I was happy in a way I didn't remember being in a long time. "I'm happy," I admitted, and the words came out easier than expected, because they were simply true. "Hector is incredible." Even saying it out loud seemed insufficient to capture everything he was, all the ways he surprised me daily with kindness and attention, hidden beneath that dangerous Mafia boss facade. Jamie studied me for a long moment before asking the obvious question hanging between us. Even though he's a Mafia boss, there was no judgment in her voice, just genuine curiosity about how I had reconciled that part of his life with everything I swore to abandon 5 years ago. "He doesn't force me into that life," I replied, and I felt something tighten in my chest with gratitude because that was absolutely true. "He lets me be me, work at the bar, have my independence, keep distance from his business, and he loves me like this, without trying to change me or pull me into something I don't want." "So you love him?" Jamie asked, and the direct question caught me off guard, even though I knew we would eventually get there. I was silent for a moment, processing the question and the answer I already knew, but was afraid to vocalize because saying it out loud made everything more real and scary. So much, I finally admitted, and the word came out in a whisper loaded with emotion. More than I thought possible. And it was true. I had fallen in love with Hector Ricci in ways I didn't know were possible. Had fallen in love with the way he looked at me as if I were the only person in the world, with the kindness hidden beneath the hardness, with the way he respected my boundaries without making me feel like I was losing something. Jamie smiled and extended her hand to squeeze mine in a gesture of silent support, and we stayed like that for a moment, just being friends who had known each other for years and understood without needing many words. The rest of the night passed in lighter conversation and laughter, and when Jamie left, she hugged me tight and whispered, "Be happy, you deserve it," in my ear in a way that made my eyes burn slightly. The next day, I was at the bar when Hector had the conversation with Logan that would change everything, and he had waited until he was alone in the mansion office with only his brother and right-hand man as witness. Logan was reviewing some reports when Hector spoke suddenly, the words coming out in a casual tone that didn't match their weight. "I'm going to ask her to marry me," Hector said, and Logan almost dropped the papers he was holding, his head lifting so fast it was surprising he didn't hurt his neck. His eyes widened with genuine shock, because despite knowing Hector was serious about me, marriage was another level entirely. "Seriously?" Logan said, and his voice came out in a high-pitched tone that would have been funny under other circumstances. "Boss, this is huge." There was admiration and something like pride in the way he looked at Hector, as if he were seeing his brother finally find something beyond power and territory. "I know," Hector responded, and leaned back in his chair with that thoughtful expression that appeared when he was considering something important. "But she's everything, and I want her forever." The words came out simple but loaded with absolute conviction, without a shadow of doubt or hesitation. Logan was silent for a moment, processing, and then asked the obvious question anyone would ask. Will she accept? There was genuine concern there because they both knew I had reservations about this life, that I had spent years trying to escape everything Hector represented. "I hope so," Hector said, and for the first time there was a vulnerability in his voice he rarely showed to anyone, because if not, a pause where something like absolute determination passed through his eyes. "I'll ask every day until she accepts." Logan laughed, and the sound came out genuine and full of fraternal affection that made him seem younger and less dangerous. "You're gone for her," he said, and it wasn't an accusation but a statement of obvious fact. "Completely," Hector admitted without hesitation, and there was something like peace in the way he said it, as if having completely surrendered to me was the easiest decision he had ever made. They stayed in silence for a moment, sharing mutual understanding about love and commitment, and then Logan stood up and put his hand on his brother's shoulder in a gesture of silent support. "She'll say yes," Logan said with conviction that came from having observed us over the last months, from having seen the way we looked at each other when we thought no one was paying attention. "And you'll be happy, boss. You deserve this." That night, when I came back from the bar, Hector was waiting in the living room with that expression I was learning to recognize as meaning he had something on his mind, and when he pulled me to sit beside him on the couch and just hugged me without saying anything, I felt something tighten in my chest with gratitude for having found this, for having found him. I didn't know yet about the marriage plans, didn't know that in a few weeks my life would change again in ways I couldn't predict. But in that moment, just existing in his arms, I was perfectly happy. "I love you," he murmured against my hair, and my heart still skipped a beat every time he said those words, even though I'd heard them hundreds of times in the last months. "I love you too," I replied, and snuggled closer, letting his warmth and security envelop me completely. And in that quiet room with just the two of us and the future stretching out full of possibilities, I allowed myself to believe that maybe I had finally found my place, my person, my home. Chapter 7.
Yes. Always yes.
Proposal 6 months had passed since I decided to stay, since that first real kiss at the mansion entrance that changed everything between us. And life had settled into a routine that was perfectly imperfect in all the ways that mattered. I woke up in Hector's arms, worked at the bar during the day, maintaining that part of me that needed independence, and came back every night to the mansion that had stopped being his, to become ours in ways both subtle and significant. It was a Friday afternoon when Hector showed up at the bar during my shift, something he rarely did because he respected that space as being mine, and the way he was dressed, dark suit but no tie, and with that expression I still couldn't completely decipher, made something flip in my stomach with nervous anticipation. Jamie shot me a meaningful look when he approached the bar, and I rolled my eyes at her before turning completely to Hector with a smile that always came automatically when I saw him. "Hi," I said, wiping my hands on my apron and leaning slightly over the bar. "Wasn't expecting you here. Everything okay?" There was a small worry in my voice, because unexpected visits still made me slightly nervous, even knowing Lindsay was far away, and there were no immediate threats. "Everything's perfect," Hector responded, and the small smile that touched his lips had something mysterious about it that made my curiosity spike. "But I need you to leave early today. There's a place I want to take you." It wasn't exactly a request, but it also wasn't an order. It was in that middle ground we had developed where he expressed desires, and I had the freedom to agree or refuse. "What place?" I asked, already untying my apron, because honestly, any excuse to leave early on a slow day like this was welcome. Jamie waved her hand, dismissing me with that complicit smile that said she knew exactly how gone I was for this man, and I tossed the apron on the bar, grabbing my purse from under the sink. "Surprise," was all Hector said, and extended his hand to me with that old-fashioned courtesy that never failed to make my heart skip a beat. I put my hand in his and let him guide me out of the bar, and when we got to the car, I saw it was just the two of us with no driver or security in sight, something that happened rarely and usually meant he wanted privacy for something important. The drive lasted approximately 40 minutes, leaving the city toward the coast, and Hector drove in comfortable silence while I looked out the window trying to guess our destination. The road got progressively narrower until we arrived at a lookout point I didn't know existed, a small piece of land that jutted out over cliffs with a completely unobstructed view of the ocean that stretched infinite and blue under the sky that was beginning to take on orange tones with the approaching sunset. "Why did we come here?" I asked when we got out of the car, and my voice came out soft, because there was something in the atmosphere of the place that asked for reverent silence, something in the way the wind carried the smell of salt, and the way the waves crashed on the rocks below, creating natural, hypnotizing music. Hector turned to me and held both my hands in his, and the way he looked at me had that focused intensity that always made the rest of the world disappear, leaving only the two of us existing in that specific moment. "Because you said you dreamed of a place like this," he said, and his voice came out soft but loaded with meaning. "View, ocean, peace." I blinked in surprise because honestly I didn't remember saying that. It was the type of casual comment you make during conversations without thinking much about the words. "I said that?" I asked, trying to search my memory and failing to locate when exactly that conversation had happened. 3 months ago, Hector responded, and there was something like tenderness in the way he spoke. Casually. "We were having dinner, and you commented on a book you were reading where the characters got married in a place like this. But I remember everything you say, Jody. Every word, every dream, every wish you mention, even if you think it doesn't matter." My heart was hammering now because I was starting to understand where this was going, starting to connect the dots between the place and the conversation, and the way Hector was looking at me as if I were the most precious thing in his world. He took a deep breath, and when he continued speaking, his voice had dropped to that low tone that vibrated through my entire body. "Jody, you saved me," he said, and I saw genuine emotion passing through his dark eyes. Literally that day at the restaurant when you kissed a stranger to divert a shooter's attention, but also emotionally. A pause where he squeezed my hands lightly as if he needed that physical contact to continue. "You made me feel again. Want more than empire and power and territory. Want you. Want future and family and all those things I thought I'd never have." Tears were already starting to blur my vision because I knew what was coming next, but still wasn't completely prepared for the reality of it. And then Hector released one of my hands and knelt there at the lookout with the ocean as witness and the sun setting, painting everything gold and red, and my heart practically stopped beating. "Hector," the word came out in a shocked gasp, and my hands automatically went to cover my mouth as tears started running down my face, and he smiled that small, genuine smile that was only mine before pulling a small velvet box from the inside pocket of his jacket. When he opened the box, it revealed a ring that was perfect in ways I didn't even know were possible, delicate but strong at the same time. A solitaire diamond that caught the sunset light and sparkled as if it had its own light. "Jody Russo, will you marry me?" Hector asked, and his voice came out firm but loaded with emotion he wasn't trying to hide. "Here, in this place, just the two of us. The way you always dreamed, you remembered," I managed to say between sobs, and the words came out choppy because I was crying openly now, all the emotion from the last 6 months coming out at once. "My dream, how I wanted it to be, every word," Hector repeated, and I saw that his eyes were also shining slightly with emotion, even though no tears fell. "So, do you accept? Will you spend the rest of your life with me? Let me love you the way you deserve? Build a future together?" "Yes!" The word came out in a shout of pure joy that echoed over the ocean. "Always yes. 1,000 times yes." I pulled him back to his feet and threw myself into his arms with enough force to almost knock us over, and he laughed against my hair while holding me tight and spinning once completely before putting me back on the ground. With slightly trembling hands, he took the ring from the box and slid it onto my finger, and it fit perfectly as if it had been made specifically for me. And then he pulled me into a kiss that tasted like promise and future, and everything I never knew I wanted until I found him. When we finally separated to breathe, we were both smiling like idiots, and my cheeks hurt from smiling so much, but I couldn't stop. That's when his words finally processed completely in my brain, still dizzy with emotion. "Wait," I said, wiping tears from my face with trembling hands. "You said here? You want to get married here? Now?" The question came out in a mix of shock and hope, because that seemed too good to be true. "If you want," Hector responded, and discreetly pointed behind me where I had been so focused on him that I hadn't noticed an older man with an official appearance standing at a respectful distance along with Logan, who was smiling in that way that made him look years younger. I brought an officiant, and Logan as a witness. "But if you want to wait, plan something bigger." "No!" I cut him off before he could finish the sentence, and the word came out at a volume that made everyone smile. "I want now. Just us. Exactly like this. Because this was perfect. It was exactly how I had dreamed, even without realizing I was dreaming, without unnecessary formality or hundreds of people we didn't know, just us and the ocean and the people who really mattered." The smile that lit up Hector's face was absolutely radiant, pure happiness transforming his features in ways I rarely saw, and that made him look years younger. "Then let's get married," he said, and took my hand again, intertwining our fingers. Now and here, the way it always should be. And as the officiant approached and Logan positioned his phone to record because apparently he was in charge of documenting this, I looked at Hector with the sun setting behind him, painting everything in impossible colors, and thought that maybe all the pain and loss of recent years had been necessary to bring me exactly here, exactly to him, exactly to this perfect moment. Chapter 8: Wedding and Honeymoon.
My husband.
My wife.
30 minutes after the proposal, I was standing at the lookout with the wind blowing my hair and the sun descending rapidly toward the horizon, and none of it seemed completely real, even with the ring weighing on my finger, and Hector holding my hand as if he were afraid I would disappear if he let go. The officiant was an older man with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed to have witnessed hundreds of weddings but could still seem genuinely touched by the scene, and Logan was standing beside him with his phone in hand, recording everything with that smile I rarely saw on his usually serious face. That's when I heard the sound of tires on gravel and turned around surprised because I wasn't expecting anyone else, and my heart jumped when I saw Jamie getting out of her old car with wide eyes and an expression that mixed shock and absolute joy. I looked at Hector questioningly, and he just shrugged with that small smile that meant he had planned everything down to the smallest detail. "Did you really think I'd let you get married without your best friend here?" he asked, and the thoughtfulness of that simple gesture made my eyes burn again with tears. I thought I'd already exhausted. Jamie practically ran to me and pulled me into a hug so tight it took my breath away, and when we separated, she was crying too and laughing at the same time in that way only she could do. "You're getting married!" Jamie practically shouted, holding my face between her hands and looking at me as if she were memorizing the moment. "Now, here, this is so you I can't even believe it." And she was right. This was exactly me, impulsive and romantic and perfect in ways no wedding planned for months could be. The officiant cleared his throat softly, bringing our attention back, and Jamie and Logan positioned themselves as witnesses, while Hector and I stood facing each other with the ocean roaring behind us and the sky exploding in shades of orange and pink and purple that looked like they came from a painting. The wind carried the smell of salt and possibility, and when the officiant began speaking about love and commitment, I barely heard the words because I was completely focused on Hector's eyes, looking at me with an intensity that made everything else disappear. "The bride and groom have prepared their own vows," the officiant announced, and Hector squeezed my hands lightly before starting to speak, and his voice came out firm, but loaded with emotion he wasn't trying to hide. "You saved me with a kiss," Hector said, and I saw the exact moment Logan and Jamie processed those words and understood the story behind how we met. That day at the restaurant when a stranger decided my life was worth saving even without knowing me. Now I promise to love you every day I have left, to protect you from everything I can, even knowing you're perfectly capable of protecting yourself, to respect you in every choice you make even when I disagree. Always. He paused, and I saw something shine in his eyes that could have been tears even though none fell. And when he continued, his voice had dropped to that low tone that vibrated through my body. You are my equal, Jody. Not something I possess, but someone who chooses to be by my side every day. My queen, my everything. And I promise to spend each day proving I deserve that choice. Tears were already running freely down my face, and I wasn't even trying to stop them. And when it was my turn to speak, I had to take several deep breaths before I could make the words come out without my voice breaking completely. You gave me new life, I began, and squeezed his hands because I needed that contact to keep me centered. When I thought I had lost everything that mattered, when I spent 5 years just existing without really living, you appeared and showed me I could have love without violence, partnership without losing my identity, without the Mafia, just love. Jamie sobbed behind me, and I heard the sound of her trying to muffle her crying, and that gave me courage to continue because if my best friend was witnessing this, then it was real in ways that couldn't be undone. I promise to love you in all your sides, the gentle and the dangerous, the kind and the ruthless. I promise to challenge you when you need it and support you always. I promise to make you happy because you make me happy in ways I didn't even know were possible, always. The efficient smiled and declared with a voice that carried over the wind, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. And Hector didn't wait even a second before pulling me against him and kissing me with an intensity that made my knees weak, and the entire world reduced to just that moment, that kiss, that man who was now my husband in legal and emotional and absolute ways. The kiss lasted while the sun touched the horizon, painting everything golden. And when we finally separated, we were both smiling and crying at the same time. And Jamie and Logan applauded while the officiant offered congratulations with that genuine warmth of someone who loved their work. Hector rested his forehead against mine, and we stayed like that for a long moment, just breathing the same air and processing that we had really done this, that we were married now, in ways that changed everything. My wife, he murmured, testing the words, and the smile that lit up his face was so radiant it made my heart clench. My husband, I replied, and the words felt strange and perfect at the same time on my tongue. Jamie hugged us then, pulling both of us into a group hug that Logan eventually joined too, and we stayed like that for a moment, just being people who cared, celebrating something beautiful and rare. 2 weeks later, I was in Greece, on a private island that Hector had rented for our honeymoon, and the place was so absurdly beautiful. It seemed unreal, with turquoise blue water and white sand, and a small village with just the two of us, and some discreet staff who appeared only to bring food and quickly disappeared. We had spent the days exploring the island, swimming in the crystal clear sea, making love on every available surface of the luxurious house, and just existing in each other's space without responsibilities or obligations pulling our attention. It was our 10th day there, and I was on the beach watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, my feet buried in the warm sand and my light summer dress dancing around my legs with the breeze. Hector approached from behind and wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me against his chest, and rested his chin on my shoulder, while we both watched the sun slowly descend. This is perfect, I said, and my voice came out in a satisfied sigh that carried absolute peace. Thank you for all this, for giving me exactly what I needed without even knowing I needed it. You deserve everything, Hector responded, and pressed a soft kiss on my neck that sent shivers up my skin. We stayed in comfortable silence for a moment before he spoke again, and there was something in his voice that made my attention focus completely. Jody, I have a question. My heart sped up slightly because his tone suggested it was something important, but I turned in his arms so I could see his face when he asked. You can ask, I replied, placing my hands on his chest and feeling his heart beating firmly under my palms. Hector looked at me with that intensity that never failed to make my stomach flip, and when he spoke, the words came out careful, as if he were treading on delicate ground. Do you want children someday? The question hung between us, loaded with meaning and possibility, and I felt my heart speed up even more because this was big. It was life-changing in ways nothing else would be, but the answer came easy, instinctive, right in ways that didn't need analysis or prolonged consideration. Yes, I replied, and saw relief pass through his eyes. I do, with you. I paused and let a small smile touch my lips before asking the question back. And you? Very much, Hector said immediately, and the absolute conviction in his voice left no room for doubt, but no pressure. When you're ready, when it's the right time for you. And that was so characteristic of him, always giving me choice and control even when he clearly wanted something intensely. I looked at this man who was my husband, who knew me in ways no one else did, who loved me without trying to change me, and felt courage rise through my chest, pushing me to vocalize something that had been growing for weeks. What if I said I'm ready? I asked, and saw his eyes widen slightly. Not right now, but soon, very soon. The smile that lit up Hector's face was absolutely radiant, transforming his features in ways that made him look years younger, and he pulled me into a kiss that tasted like promise and future and everything we would build together. Then we start trying, he murmured against my lips. Whenever you want. Soon, I repeated, and felt something tighten pleasantly in my chest, with anticipation of everything that would come. Very soon. Can't wait, Hector said, and kissed me again while the sun finally touched the horizon, and the sky exploded in final colors before night fell. And there, standing on the beach of the private island with just the two of us, and the future stretching out full of infinite possibilities, I allowed myself to believe we had found something rare and precious that would be worth protecting, with everything we had. Chapter 9. 1 year later, and new life.
We're having a baby.
I know. I love you.
1 year had passed since that sunset at the lookout where Hector had knelt and completely changed my life, and I was returning to the same place on the exact anniversary of our wedding, with my heart pounding for completely different reasons this time. Hector was driving with that small smile that meant he thought he was surprising me, even though obviously I knew where we were going. And when we arrived at the familiar lookout with the ocean stretching infinite and the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, I felt something tighten in my chest with the circular perfection of that moment. We got out of the car and walked to the exact spot where we had gotten married, and Hector pulled me against him in a hug that was familiar and comfortable, in ways a year together had become second nature. 1 year, I said, resting my head on his chest and listening to the steady heartbeat. Feels like yesterday you proposed here. Best year of my life, Hector responded, pressing a kiss on top of my head. There was a pause, and then he released me just enough to look at my face, and there was something in his dark eyes that made my pulse race. And this next one, it's going to be even better. Why? I asked, even though I already knew part of the answer because I'd been carrying the biggest secret inside me for a week, waiting for the perfect moment to tell. Hector touched my face with that gentleness that never failed to surprise me, and when he spoke, his voice had that hopeful quality he rarely showed. Because maybe we start our family? His eyes searched mine looking for confirmation. You said you were ready. My heart raced, and I felt tears starting to blur my vision, because this was the moment. This was exactly how I had planned to tell him. I took his hand and placed it over my belly that was still completely flat, but carried the greatest miracle. Hector, what if I said that? We already started. He went completely still, his eyes slowly widening as he processed my words and their meaning, and I saw the exact moment he understood completely. What? The word came out in a trembling whisper I had never heard coming from him, vulnerable and shocked and hopeful all at the same time. I'm pregnant, I said, and tears were already running freely down my face. 8 weeks. Found out last week, and I wanted to tell you here, where it all began, where you proposed to me and where we got married. I squeezed his hand still over my belly. Here where our life really began. Hector made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and then I saw something I had never seen before, tears filling his eyes, and finally overflowing and running down his face, as he looked at me with an emotion so raw and pure it made my heart almost burst. Really? He managed to say, his voice breaking completely. We're going to be parents, I confirmed, smiling through tears. Yes, you're going to be a father, Hector. And that finally broke what remained of his control, and he fell to his knees in front of me, with his hands trembling slightly when he touched my belly, with a reverence that made more tears fall from my eyes. Hi, little one, Hector said, speaking directly to my belly, and his voice came out hoarse with emotion. I'm your father, and I already love you, as much as I love your mother. He pressed a soft kiss over the fabric of my dress where his hands rested, and then raised his eyes to meet mine, completely shining with tears and joy. Thank you for saving me, for loving me, for giving me everything. I knelt with him there on the lookout floor, not caring about dirt or anything beyond being at the same level as him, and hugged him with all the strength I had. Thank you for seeing me, I whispered against his neck, for loving me exactly as I am, for making my dreams come true in ways I didn't even know were possible. Always, Hector promised, and we stayed like that for a long moment, just hugging each other and crying with happiness, while the sun descended, painting the sky in impossible colors. When we finally separated enough to look at each other, we were both laughing through tears in that way that only happens when joy is absolute and overflowing. Boy or girl? Hector asked, wiping tears from my face with his thumbs before wiping his own. Too early to know, I replied, placing my hand over his that still rested on my belly. But I feel like it's a girl. Then she'll be a little warrior, Hector said, and the smile that lit up his face was so full of love and pride. It made my chest tighten. Like her mother, he pulled me into another kiss, soft and sweet, and full of promises. And stubborn like her father, I replied when we separated, and he laughed, the sound coming out genuine and free in ways I loved to provoke. Perfect then, Hector said, and helped me up before guiding me to the edge of the lookout where we could sit with our legs dangling over the void and the ocean roaring below. We sat, embraced, his hand immediately returning to my belly, in a gesture I knew would become constant in the coming months, and we stayed in comfortable silence, just watching the sun touch the horizon. "Hector, are you happy?" I finally asked, needing to hear confirmation, even though I already knew the answer. "Really, happier than I ever imagined possible," he responded without hesitation. "You gave me new life, Jody. Family, love, everything that really matters. And now?" His hand gently caressed my belly. "A baby. Our family grows. How can I be anything other than completely happy?" "Me too," I admitted, resting my head on his shoulder. "I'm complete. For the first time since my father died, I have a real home. You gave me that. Love I thought impossible. Family I didn't even know I wanted. A future I can barely wait to live." We stayed like that while the sun finally disappeared completely, leaving the sky in shades of purple and deep blue, with the first stars beginning to appear. Hector leaned over and whispered to my belly again, his voice soft but loaded with emotion and promise. "Hi, little one. Your daddy again. Just wanted to say you have the most incredible mother in the world. She saved me with a kiss when she didn't even know me, and now she gives me you, the greatest gift." He paused, and I felt a kiss being pressed against my belly through the dress. "I promise to always protect you, love you unconditionally, teach you everything I know, and give you a better life than mine. You'll be free, happy, loved, always. You're going to be an incredible father," I managed to say, through tears that started again, and he hugged me tighter while the stars shone above us. And there at that lookout where it all began, where he had proposed to me, and where we had gotten married under the sunset, sitting embraced with my hand and his over our daughter growing inside me, I knew with absolute certainty that I had found my happy ending. The kiss that saved one life had saved two, had created eternal love, and now would create a new family. Everything had been worth it to arrive exactly here, exactly now, exactly with him. And now let's discover some fun facts about this story that you might not have noticed. The lookout appears exactly 3 times in the story: marriage proposal, ceremony, and pregnancy reveal, becoming the couple's sacred place. Hector remembered a casual comment Jody made 3 months earlier about dreaming of getting married in a place with an ocean view, showing he literally remembers everything she says. The wedding happened only 30 minutes after the proposal, from yes to complete ceremony, making it one of the fastest weddings possible. Anthony Russo died when Jody was 23, making her 28 years old in the story. Exactly 5 years trying to live a normal life as a bartender before Hector. Jane Volkoff was never captured. After being knocked out by Jody at the bar, she simply disappeared and was never mentioned again. Marcus was the only named character who died in the story. Not even Lindsay was killed, only shot in the leg, showing Hector's restraint. Jamie is literally the only person who knew Jody's past before the events of Chapter 1, making her the guardian of the biggest secret. Logan almost crashed the car when he found out Jody was Anthony Russo's daughter, the most extreme physical reaction of any character throughout the narrative. And if you want to see another love story, click on the video that appears now on your screen.